Have you noticed that in media we very commonly find groups of three? The power trio, or the three-man band, is a trope very old and very common. So let's have a look at why. Why do we split characters into groups of three? As human beings, we tend to see things in threes. We tend to form groups of three in friendships. We can comfortably hold conversation with two partners. When we add a fourth person, someone is usually talked over or vaguely forgotten. We find it fairly easy to see in threes in visual material. When we increase from 3 to 4, we can often get confused. I can prove it. Let's have a quick look at these. Which one do you prefer looking at? It's number 1, right? Well, it certainly was for me. The first one is split into 3. You've got 3 sections, you've got 3 fonts. With number 2, the logo has been moved around. Just the smallest bit of displacement confuses you. It adds more elements that are unwanted. We just went from 3 to 6, and with number 3 it's just a bit of a mess. It's hard to concentrate on, it has 5 fonts, lots of elements, and it's just very confusing. Or at least it was for me, and marketing seems to agree. You see the rule of 3 turn up all over the place in marketing. McDonald's have several different logos that they use. I looked in the 1995 brand guide and here are the main 3 logos. Notice anything? They all use the rule of 3 over and over. 3 colors, 3 fonts. Sometimes 3 elements. It's easy to look at because it's so simple. You don't even get slightly confused. A lot of this is down to its simple rule of threes design principle. You see this over and over in marketing. Apparently, even more commonly in food and drink companies. It's not just graphic design that it's used in. It's very common in political speeches. People tend to list things in threes, so political campaigns make use of this by having their slogans be in threes. For example, Tony Blair used it in his campaign in the 90s.
Ask me my 3 main priorities for government, and I tell you, education, education, and education.
And the Conservative Party's used it in almost every election since.
By staying at home, we can protect our NHS and save lives.
So we've clarified that we as human beings are generally drawn to the idea of the rule of 3, right? Right. So let's have a look at the idea of splitting groups of characters into threes. There are many examples of this all throughout cinema. Here I'm going to be looking at some examples that came to mind when I thought about it for a brief time. Jurassic Park. Okay, you might not think of Jurassic Park as having the most complex character dynamics in cinema, and you'd be right. However, when I thought of splitting groups of characters systematically into 3, Jurassic Park is one that immediately came to mind. You probably haven't noticed it as deliberate, or maybe you did and you're just more observant than me. I'm going to start with the scene just before the main cast go on the park tour. There are quite a lot of characters in this scene. You have Grant, Sattler, Malcolm, Hammond, Gennaro, and the 2 kids. This is 7 characters, which is quite a complex system. So what does Spielberg do? He sends them all into cars, notably 3 per car, and then sends Hammond back to the command center. That leads from this diagram to this new diagram here. He has split almost all the characters into groups of 3. This allows the dynamic between Malcolm, Sattler and Grant to be explored in more depth. You get to spend a little time with them and look at how they interact with each other. Due to the car setting, you can also see the dynamic between Lex and Tim, because they aren't distracted by the adults, and it sets up Gennaro as being a scumbag. Hammond is sent into a group of 4, but not for very long. This scene is also spent characterizing some of the characters, specifically Nedry and Muldoon. Notice how, with a group of 4, some of the characters are left out. A small group allows all the characters to interact easier, so you can better see their relationships. Spielberg splits the characters into 3 or less constantly throughout the movie. I mean, just look. Nedry leaves and dies, leaving 3 groups of 3. A notable thing here is that there's at least one character in each group that has not been set up as safe, by either being a main protagonist or being a child. This massively ups the tension in these scenes. You wouldn't feel as if the characters were in real danger if deep down you felt that they were all safe. If you felt deep down that all of the characters were in danger, in some cases, that could lead to you not focusing on the character that is about to die, so you miss their final characterizations. This can work as a dynamic, but in this case I feel it wouldn't work quite as well. I personally find it more stressful to be worried about one character rather than an entire group of characters. Plus, an entire trio just dying might feel like you've been betrayed by the family film genre. The T-Rex attack then happens and the groups are mixed up again. We now have 2 groups of 3 and a group of 2. Briefly, a large group is formed, then it's changed to smaller groups again, Okay, sure, not every group that is formed is a trio, but it's not very often larger than a trio. Then everyone's split into pairs. Then for the final act, a larger group is formed just before the movie ends. In the final act, we're not getting any new characterization, so a larger group can be sustained a little easier. An assumed relationship can also be formed from Ellie to the kids, based on Grant's relationship with them. So yes, as I have described here, Spielberg splits the characters into 3 or less constantly. This works really well for both creating dynamics and tension in the plot. So let's have a look at a more extreme example. The Lord of the Rings. Let's have a look at the Fellowship of the Ring. What's the first thing you notice here? If you said it's ridiculously complex and looks like hell to navigate, you'd be absolutely right. This is an incredibly complex web of characters. For this to be explored in a trilogy of 4-hour-long movies is practically impossible. There would not be enough time to move the plot along. And The Lord of the Rings has quite a lot of plot. So because it's so complex, 45 different relationships, the real web between characters who do actually have dynamics looks a lot more like this. Some characters, such as Aragorn and Gandalf, have a lot of defined dynamics. Other characters, such as Legolas, are islands and basically don't have any relationship with the majority of the members in the group. The web was too complex, so many of the dynamics were not defined. This web here is also still far too complex for an audience to really follow. So the web changes. Gandalf dies, the web is still too complex. What do? If you guess they kill Boromir and form trios, you'd be absolutely right. The Aragorn, Gimli and Legolas group is formed. This is one of the most fun and interesting dynamics in the series. This trio forms the core of the War of the Ring storyline. Frodo, Sam and Gollum form the Journey to Mordor storyline. Merry and Pippin sort of form a Saruman and Ent storyline. The Lord of the Rings is a good example of splitting characters up, not just so you have easier to manage dynamics, but to also form different storylines. Jurassic Park did this also, but in The Lord of the Rings the story is much more complex and calls for multiple storylines. The story goes on. Gandalf arrives, leaves, re-arrives, joins the War of the Ring group with Merry and Pippin, splits the group into 2 duos in the War of the Ring trio again, for the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Then they're all together again for the finale back at the Black Gate. I went through the latter 2/3 of the Lord of the Rings trilogy remarkably fast, but what I hope you noticed is that the characters are pretty constantly put into groups of 3, or less. Even when in larger groups, you can usually split it into the War of the Ring trio, the Hobbits, and Gandalf. Not every member of the Fellowship has a direct relationship with every other member of the Fellowship. I mean, Frodo doesn't even know Legolas's name. Probably. By splitting them into trios, you get to have more in-depth relationships between smaller groups of characters, rather than a shallow one between a much larger group. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I take it most of you have seen Guardians of the Galaxy. I'm not going to go through and explain who each character is. Volume 2 is a prime example of splitting up characters not just for dynamic reasons, but for plot reasons too. The team starts much like this. This would be very complex to open with, but pretty much all of the characters at this point have defined relationships, so it's not too bad for a few good scenes. None of the characters are particularly complex or have complex relationships, they are fairly basic ones which are spelled out early on. Nonetheless, Gunn splits them as so. He splits them into 2 trios. They get sent along 2 different plot lines, A and B. He keeps the characters together that have a stronger dynamic, such as Peter and Gamora and then Rocket and Groot. But for the story, Nebula and Drax could have switched places without much changing. Both of these teams fall into Hero, Lancer and Comic Relief, 2 guys and a girl. As the movie goes on, Nebula leaves and Yondu joins, and they all reunite for a big fight because that's how Marvel movies end. I'm not complaining with this one, I really do like this movie. Anyway, my point is, Gunn splits the party here, not so he can delve deeper into the character dynamics, it's more for having the 2 plotlines. It also makes the conversations between the characters easier as there are less characters. So why we split? As discussed, there are many reasons for splitting groups into smaller ones for a story. Smaller groups can make the conversation flow much better, and the character dynamics can be more easily explored in detail. It also allows you to have multiple plotlines as discussed in Guardians and The Lord of the Rings. But more often than not, it's about simpler dynamics between characters, but also very common for plotline reasons.